November 16th, 1944, Vancouver, Washington. A 51-year-old man dies of cancer, and the company he started just 5 years earlier is about to outlive him by more than 80 years and counting. His name is still stamped on the hood of trucks hauling freight across every state in this country. But here's what almost nobody knows: Theodore Peterman never set out to build a truck to sell. He built one because his own log trucks kept breaking down in the mountains of Washington, and he was too stubborn to keep buying somebody else's junk. This is the real documented story of how a lumber mill owner from Tacoma accidentally built an American trucking legend and never lived to see it. I'm your host at Iron Axle. If you're the kind of person who wants the real history, not the highlight reel, hit subscribe. This channel runs on stories exactly like this one. To understand how Peterbilt was born, you have to go back almost 20 years before a single truck ever rolled off a lot. And you have to start, oddly enough, with a door. Theodore Peterman, the father, not the son, came to America from Germany at just 15 years old. No money, no family waiting for him, nothing but a name and a willingness to work. He landed with an uncle in San Francisco, drifted north into the Pacific Northwest, and eventually settled in Tacoma, Washington. He worked furniture plants. He worked planing mills. And somewhere along the way, he saved enough to buy a 20-acre farm for $400, then turned around and sold it for $8,000. That's the kind of instinct that runs in families. And it was about to run straight into his son. With that money, the elder Peterman built a small sash and door plant in Tacoma. Nothing fancy. A local operation making doors and moldings for a growing city. He married a woman named Catherine Corcoran, and on March 22nd, 1893, they had a son, Theodore Alfred Peterman. The man history would eventually just call Al. Now here's where it gets interesting. Al didn't grow up dreaming about trucks. He didn't grow up dreaming about lumber. Either. What he grew up around was a father who was sharp, stubborn, and Germanic in the most old-school sense of the word, meaning if you wanted his respect, you earned it. And Al, from a very young age, kept trying. There's one story from those early years that tells you everything you need to know about who this kid was going to become. His father's mill needed logs. Most sons would have waited to be told what to do. Al didn't. He went out, found a supply of logs on his own, negotiated the purchase, and sold them back to his father's mill at a fair price and at a profit. His father was stunned and proud. A teenager had just out-hustled him on his own turf. That single moment is the whole story in miniature. Al Peterman didn't wait for permission. He saw a problem, solved it himself, and made money doing it. That instinct never left him. Then, in 1920, everything changed. Theodore Peterman Sr. died, leaving the mill to his widow, Catherine. She didn't run it herself. She called in her 27-year-old son and handed him the keys at first, just an informal arrangement, but within a few years, a full partnership. Al Peterman, barely out of his 20s, was suddenly in charge of the family business. And he didn't just keep it running. He transformed it. He saw the post-war building boom coming before most people did, and he bet on it hard. He streamlined the door-making operation. Within a year, he'd installed an entire veneer and plywood plant just to feed his own door production. And by 1923, his mother, who technically still owned the business, was reportedly paying the highest individual federal income tax of anyone in the entire state of Washington. Think about that. A door and plywood company run by a man in his 20s, out-earning nearly every business owner in the state. By 1926, Al was thinking even bigger. He bought 25 acres on the Tacoma Tide Flats and built a plant that stretched 742 feet, an entire quarter mile of manufacturing floor, under one roof. And when the Great Depression hit just a few years later, and American demand for doors collapsed overnight, most business owners would have folded. Al didn't. He looked overseas instead and built an export pipeline straight to the United Kingdom. In 1932 alone, the worst year of the Depression, he shipped over 600,000 doors to Britain. He held his crew together through the entire Depression. Every single year but one, he still turned a profit. By the mid-1930s, Al Peterman wasn't just a successful businessman. He was becoming something closer to a legend in the Pacific Northwest timber world, a man who built things nobody else thought was possible. At exactly the moment, nobody else thought it could be done. But none of it, the doors, the plywood, the export deals, none of it is why you know his name today. What comes next started as a small practical headache, a problem with getting logs out of the mountains. And solving it would end up defining the rest of his life. Here's something people forget when they talk about Peterbilt. Al Peterman never once sat down and said, "I want to start a truck company." That thought never crossed his mind. What he actually had was a much smaller, much more annoying problem, and it had nothing to do with trucks at all. His mill needed logs, a lot of them, constantly, and those logs were sitting up in the hills around Morton, Washington, roughly 60 miles southeast of his Tacoma plant. Back then, in the early 1930s, if you wanted to move timber that kind of distance, you used the railroad. That's just how it was done. Everybody did it that way. Al looked at that setup and decided it was too slow, too rigid, too expensive. Rail cars ran on rail schedules. They went where the tracks went, not where the logs actually were. And Al Peterman was not a man who liked waiting on somebody else's timetable. So in 1934, he did something almost nobody else in his position would have bothered doing. He didn't hire a trucking company. He didn't place an order for new equipment. He went out and bought 15 worn out retired Army surplus trucks that Shell Oil had already thrown away, trucks nobody wanted, sitting there with solid rubber tires and hand crank engines built for a completely different job. Then he hauled them into his own machine shop in Tacoma and started tearing them apart. This is the part of the story that actually explains everything that came later. Al wasn't a trained engineer. He didn't have a degree in mechanical design. What he had was a friend named Ed Valentine, a guy people in Morton described as having pure mechanical instinct, the kind you can't teach, and together, the two of them rebuilt those Army trucks from the ground up. Solid tires got ripped off and replaced with pneumatic ones that could actually handle logging roads. Hand cranks were tossed out for electric starters. And the brakes, the old mechanical brakes that were never built for hauling tons of timber down a mountain grade, those got converted to air brakes. None of this was glamorous work. It was two guys in a shop, covered in grease, solving one mechanical headache after another because the roads up around Morton didn't care what kind of truck you brought. And somewhere in the middle of all that trial and error, Al came up with something nobody had really figured out, yet a new axle design. He patented it. It used a special knee action setup that spread the weight of a load evenly across dual wheels, even when the truck was bouncing over skid roads full of ruts and holes. That one invention meant less breakdowns, less maintenance, and trucks that could actually keep working instead of sitting broken on the side of a mountain. Picture what that actually meant for his operation. Before this, hauling logs out of rough terrain wore equipment down fast. Every breakdown meant lost time, lost money, and a mill sitting idle waiting on timber that wasn't coming. Al's axle design changed that math completely. His logging costs dropped to numbers his competitors couldn't touch at one point. Just $4 for stumpage and $13.50 for logs delivered to his sawmill. That's not a small improvement. That's an entire industry's cost structure getting rewritten by one stubborn mill owner and his mechanic. Word started getting around. Other logging operations wanted what Al had built. And here's the part that most people watching this would never guess. Al Peterman never set out to sell that axle design to anybody. He wasn't chasing a business opportunity. He built it because his own trucks kept failing, and he was too impatient to keep losing money to broken equipment. But that single invention a fix for his own problem, nothing more was about to pull him into an industry he had absolutely no plan of entering. Because around 1935, on one of his regular trips down to San Francisco, Al heard a piece of news that would change everything. A truck company he already knew, a company whose trucks he actually admired and had bought before, had just collapsed. And its factory was sitting there, waiting for somebody with the money and the nerve to take it. The company was called Fageol, And if you were in the trucking business back in the early 1930s, that name meant something. Fageol trucks had a reputation for being built tough, sturdy frames, solid engineering, the kind of machine that could actually survive real work. Al Peterman knew this firsthand because he'd already been buying Fageol trucks for years. He liked them enough to modify them himself for his own logging roads. He was, in every sense, a loyal customer. But loyal customers don't always save a company. And by the early 1930s, the Depression had done what the Depression did to almost everyone it choked Fageol's business until there was nothing left. The company went under. Its creditors took over what remained, including a mostly idle factory sitting out in Oakland, California, with nothing running inside it. Now, most people hear bankrupt factory and think that's the end of the story. For Al Peterman, it was the opening line of a new one. He was down in San Francisco, one of his regular trips, the kind he took constantly for business, sometimes for pleasure. Often for both at once when word reached him that this Fageol plant was sitting there for sale. And Al didn't hesitate the way a cautious businessman might. He didn't commission a study. He didn't bring in consultants to evaluate the risk. He walked in, looked at what was there, and made an offer on the spot reportedly around $50,000 for the factory, the tooling, and everything left inside it. Think about what that decision actually was. This was a lumber mill owner, a plywood manufacturer, a man whose entire career had been built on doors and veneer, buying a truck factory almost on instinct. Not because he had some grand 5-year plan to conquer the trucking industry, because he saw an opportunity sitting right in front of him. And he'd spent his whole life being the kind of man who moves fast when he sees one. He took over the Oakland plant and started building trucks under his own operation. And this is where one of the most quietly brilliant details of the entire story comes in the name. Fageol's own employees, back when the company was still running, used to have an affectionate nickname for their trucks. They called them Bill-Bilt, after the company's president, a man named W.H. Bill. It was shop floor slang, the kind of nickname factory workers give things when they're proud of what they make. Al Peterman heard that. And he didn't need to hire a branding consultant or run a focus group. He just took that same structure, a man's name, plus Bilt, and swapped it for his own. Peterman, Bilt, Peterbilt, it's almost embarrassingly simple when you say it out loud. But that's exactly why it worked. It wasn't invented by a marketing department decades later trying to manufacture a legacy. It came straight out of a factory floor tradition that already existed, reshaped around the man who just bought the place. And here's what really separates Al Peterman from almost every other manufacturer chasing growth in that era. At the exact moment Henry Ford was pushing out hundreds of vehicles a day on an assembly line built for speed and volume, Al Peterman went the opposite direction, on purpose. He set a goal of building just 100 trucks a year. Not thousands, not even close to 1,000, 100. In that first year, 1939, his factory produced 14 trucks. 14, if you were watching from the outside, that number might look like failure. It wasn't. It was a decision. Al wasn't trying to flood the market. He was trying to build something people could trust with their livelihood, a truck a logger could take up a mountain road and actually depend on. Not just another machine rolling off a line to hit a quota. The following year, that number climbed to 82. Slow, deliberate growth built on a reputation instead of a rush. And that decision to build fewer trucks, but build them right, is the exact reason this company is still on American highways more than 80 years later. While 100 other manufacturers from that same era have completely disappeared. But Al Peterman wasn't just a careful businessman behind closed doors. Off the clock, he was something else entirely. And the stories from those years are the kind you genuinely couldn't make up. By the mid-1930s, Al Peterman had money. Real money. And the way a man spends money once he actually has it tells you more about him than any balance sheet ever could. In 1935, a strike hit the entire West Coast lumber and plywood industry bitter, drawn out. The kind of labor dispute that turned neighbors against each other in mill towns up and down the coast. Al's own plant got caught up in it. Now, most owners in that position dug in, called in extra security, treated the picket line like an enemy camp. Al Peterman set up a tent. Right outside his own mill, while his own workers stood outside picketing him, Al put out a fresh keg of beer and sandwiches for the men walking the line. When his Eastern sales representative, a man named Jim Walby, showed up and saw what was going on, Al just grinned at him and said, "I'm on strike too. Why don't you join the pickets and have a beer?" That's not a businessman managing a labor dispute. That's a man who genuinely liked people, even the ones currently protesting against him. And the stories only get better from there. Al had a friend named Alex Holden, a barnstorming pilot who kept his plane parked at a small airfield outside Tacoma. Alex had taken Al up flying more than once, but one day Al wanted to fly, and Alex wasn't around. So Al, a man who had never once piloted an aircraft in his life, climbed into that plane alone, took it up into the sky, and somehow brought it back down in one piece. When Alex found out, he was furious. He told Al never to try something that reckless again. Al tried it again anyway. That second attempt didn't go quite as smoothly. Then there's the Cadillac story, which might be my favorite piece of the entire Al Peterman legend. He walks into the dealership, buys a brand new Cadillac, drives it around the block once, and pulls straight back into the lot. The dealer comes running out, panicked, asking what's wrong with the car. Al just looks at him and says, "Nothing. Order me another one just like this one." He wasn't checking if it worked, he just liked buying Cadillacs. Or take the house trailer. Al used to visit his logging camp up in Morton regularly, but he had one irrational fear that the little hotel he stayed at would burn down while he was inside it. So his solution was to buy a deluxe house trailer and hitch it to his car so he'd always have his own place to sleep. Only problem, Al was used to driving 60, 70 miles an hour everywhere he went. Towing that trailer meant crawling along at 35. He lasted exactly one trip. He drove straight into his own truck garage, called for his head mechanic, and said, "Get your blowtorch. Cut this trailer off and give it to the first person who walks by." And then there's the wire rope negotiation, which honestly tells you everything about how his mind worked. A broker from Grays Harbor came to him needing to sell a large quantity of wire rope for his logging operation. Al asked the price. The broker told him $1,500. Al went dead silent for a good 20 seconds. Then his voice boomed out, "I'll give you $800. The broker knew that was as far as Al would move, so he just said, almost begging, "Please, Mr. Peterman, $100 at a time." This was a man who worked as hard as anyone on his payroll, who'd call his foreman at midnight with some new idea and expect a crew ready by 6 the next morning, and then show up himself and work right alongside them. But when the work was done, he lived exactly as big as he built. Flamboyant, generous, impossible to predict. One of Tacoma's most respected businessmen, and also one of its most talked about characters. But underneath every one of these stories was a man who was quietly, relentlessly building something enormous. And in just a few short years, the entire world he'd built, the mills, the plant, the trucks, all of it was about to collide head-on with something no amount of money or charm could negotiate its way past. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Within weeks, everything about how America ran itself changed overnight, and Al Peterman, sitting in Tacoma with mills and factories that had taken him 20 years to build, was about to find out that not even a man like him could negotiate with a country at war. The federal government, through its Maritime Commission, moved fast. They needed shipyard space, and Al's Tacoma plant site, that huge stretch of tide flats he'd built up piece by piece since 1926, sat in exactly the right spot to build what the Navy called baby flat tops, small escort carriers desperately needed for the Pacific War. The government didn't ask. They condemned the land. Al was ordered to vacate by June 1st, 1942. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a business deal gone bad, or a competitor outmaneuvering him. This was the United States government walking in and telling a man he had to leave the plant he'd spent his entire adult life building. He got a check for it, $875,000, and by every account, he carried that check around in his pocket for weeks afterward. Almost like he needed to keep looking at it to believe it was real. Carload after carload of machinery got hauled out. Some of it went to a plant he owned down in Garibaldi, Oregon. but the plant itself, the one on Alexander Avenue, the one that had made him one of the most respected names in Tacoma, was gone. And here's what tells you everything about who Al Peterman actually was. He didn't fight the government on it. He didn't spend the war years bitter, sitting on the sidelines complaining about what he'd lost. A tribute published in the Tacoma Chamber of Commerce newsletter that same year said it plainly Tacoma had no quarrel with the war effort, but the city deeply regretted losing him. Because in his mind, Al was already 3 steps ahead, already planning what came next. He had 30,000 acres of timber waiting on the Lewis River. He had plans drawn up for new mills, new plants, an entire second act to his career that was bigger than anything he'd built before. He genuinely believed his best years were still ahead of him. Then, in July of 1944, everything stopped. Al went in for what should have been a routine visit, and instead, doctors told him he had cancer. Not caught early, not something with years to work with. By every account from the people who knew him, this diagnosis came almost out of nowhere. 1 month he was drawing up blueprints for the biggest expansion of his life. And the next, he was fighting for his life instead. He had 4 months. On November 16, 1944, in Vancouver, Washington, Al Peterman died. He was 51 years old. Sit with that number for a second. 51. Not an old man by any measure. A man who, by every account from the people who worked beside him, still had the same restless energy at 50 that he'd had at 27, the year he first took over his father's mill. He didn't get to slow down. He didn't get to watch his empire mature into something stable and settled. He was still building, still expanding, still chasing the next plant and the next opportunity, right up until the moment his body simply couldn't keep up with the pace his mind was still setting. His wife, Ida, was the one left to handle what came next. She sold off the company's remaining assets, and piece by piece, what had once been Al Peterman's personal truck building operation eventually folded into what we now know simply as Peterbilt Motors Company. Al never saw that happen. He never saw his trucks become a household name. He never saw the brand outlive him by decades, then generations. Every mile a Peterbilt has ever driven, every logging road, every interstate, every truck stop from Washington to Florida happened after he was already gone. He built something meant to outlast him. He just never got the chance to watch it. So the next time you see a Peterbilt roll past you on the highway chrome catching the sun, engine growling past 100,000 miles like it's nothing, remember what that name actually is. It's not a brand some marketing team invented. It's not a legacy built by committee. It's a man's actual name, plus the word built. A lumber mill owner from Tacoma who never planned on any of this. He just wanted his logs off a mountain a little faster. And he was too stubborn to keep buying somebody else's broken equipment. He never got to see what it became. But we still do. Every single day, on every highway in this country. That's the real story behind the name, not the version everybody assumes. The actual one. If stories like this are the kind of history you want more of, the real stuff, dug up and told straight. No fluff, this is exactly what Iron Axle is built for. Hit subscribe, there's a lot more of this coming.